Okay, we've now reached clip 5 of this week's lecture of on structuralism. It's been quick, but you may have noticed that I've been wearing that same jumper with no stains of honey on it. And that's because I've recorded all of these clips in the trot, whereas on other days I tend to record them on different days. So sometimes I'm wearing different clothes. Sometimes you may have noticed I forget my headphones. Apologies for all these technical kind of homespun qualities or untechnical homespun qualities of my clips, but there you go. That's the best I can do. So this final clip, as usual, is the critical clip, the clip where I kind of acquaint you all with some of the main kind of criticisms that have been leveled at the approach that we look at. And in this case, the case in point is structuralism. So I've got 5 points that I want to take you through very quickly. The first one is, I mentioned how much Clifford Geertz couldn't stand Lévi-Strauss. They're both dead now, so whatever, let bygones be bygones. But what Clifford Geertz, I think, most disliked about Lévi-Strauss was the kind of very rarefied intellectualism of Lévi-Strauss. And some of you may agree with that. You know, Lévi-Strauss makes such a kind of virtue of kind of these complex plays with concepts, and makes all of society and culture ultimately a question of sophisticated thinking. You know, I mentioned in the beginning that he makes a great kind of flattens out the hierarchical distinction between the West and the rest, but he does that by turning the rest, so to speak, in inverted commas, so the societies that anthropologists of generations before him had been studying as intellectual beings who are revel in conceptual distinctions and so on. And one would like to wonder perhaps whether that's more a reflection of Lévi-Strauss's own outlook as an intellectual himself, rather than a kind of faithful description of what human culture and society are really all about. The same could be said about his enthusiastic comparison between culture, society and music, and particularly when he's talking about music as classical music. People might feel that this is quite an elitist kind of baseline from which to think about anthropological phenomena, or phenomena that anthropologists are interested in studying. So that's a kind of one line of skepticism and distaste that some people feel with Lévi-Strauss. One that was very, very big when I was a student in the 1990s and 2000s was taking Lévi-Strauss to task for the fact that he makes, and this goes also for Durkheim of course, he makes people really just be the pawns of these underlying structures and leaves very little scope for human agency, freedom, and indeed resistance on the part of human beings, right? Where's the scope for individual expression and creativity if everything that happens on the surface of social life is merely an accident, and everything that's important lies underneath the surface in these unconscious structures of binary oppositions and the play of concepts that Lévi-Strauss makes in his analyses, right? It seems that real flesh and blood human beings are just an excuse to talk about these kaleidoscopic, phantasmagoric structures. And a lot of people have found that, again, a way of really not engaging with the substance of social life and what really matters to people. People get on with their lives and have concerns, and not everything that they do is just an expression of language-like codes and structures. Another criticism that really flows directly from that is the what about politics and what about power criticism, right? I mentioned this also against culturalist approaches last week, but the very same point could be made against, and has been made against, structuralism. Doesn't Lévi-Strauss's analysis, for example, of Amerindian myths in all sorts of parts of Amazonia or indigenous North America take us into a kind of never-never land of mythology, cosmology and ritual, which never really accounts for the political conditions of these people, the fact that they have been colonial subjects, the fact that they were decimated through disease and warfare under colonialism, the fact that they are now subject to the oppressive powers of states that continue to decimate their populations through environmental degradation, and the stealing of their land, right? How does structuralism engage with these real-world political questions? Why does it seem to ignore them so easily? Is another line of criticism. Finally, a kind of twin, kind of opposed but paradoxically connected line of criticism of structuralism. One is to undermine its claim to science from the point of view of contemporary science. So, for example, cognitive anthropologists today would question the psychological assumptions on which Lévi-Strauss built his theory of binary oppositions and the way that supposedly the human mind works. Cognitive theorists, scientists today, indeed cognitive anthropologists, would query the way that Lévi-Strauss imagined that the mind works and call it far too simplistic and really a misunderstanding of psychological processes as we now are beginning to understand them through neurological, neurophysiological research as well as cognitive theoretical research, right? So his psychology was all wrong, is the kind of criticism. And with the wrong psychology, there's not much science really in his methods. And really, the analyses of structure that Lévi-Strauss provides are more of a reflection of his own mind at work rather than the mind supposedly that underpins social and cultural phenomena in the kind of studies that he provides us with. On the other side, if you like, an attack from the left, so to speak, I don't know if that's the right metaphor. Again, I'm using a structural opposition, right versus left, very powerful one, on Lévi-Strauss, is to say that really his pretensions to science are ultimately self-contradictory, because the whole point of structuralism is to show that everything is ultimately an arbitrary is ultimately a patterned system of relations and codes. And these relations, as we know from structuralism itself, are actually arbitrary, right? There's no natural or objective way to organize a system of structural oppositions and differences to generate a code-like structure. It's all a function of the ways in which you choose to distinguish things from one from another, right? There's no outside position from beyond the code in which you could ground the way that you've organized your code into some kind of independent reality. So therefore, everything is a social construction, if you like. Everything is a structural construction, and that includes structuralism and science. So therefore, the project of science that Lévi-Strauss, at least in the early part of his career, wanted to align himself with, is by the very principles of structuralism shown to be itself a social, cultural construction, and not to be grounded on some kind of ultimate truth. So that is a kind of critique of early Lévi-Strauss that might be advanced. There's plenty more that could be said critically of structuralism, but I think that for this week I've given you enough to ruminate on, like the coward does, but not the pig.